Okay. So good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Khalida Soki, nephrologist from Nairobi, and the Deputy Chair of the Young Nephrologist Committee. And I'd like to cordially invite you to this session of our webinar in English, and that is the Basics of Research Methodology, which is an AFRAN Young Nephrologist Committee collaboration. I see actually we have quite a good number of participants who have already logged in. So I'll just start with some housekeeping notes, if you don't mind, where I'd like to request that we try to join from a quiet, distraction-free zone and ensure that our microphones are muted and that your camera is turned off as you enter the virtual meeting room. We have a Q&A box, which is available for comments and for questions, and I'll request that we pose all of the questions in the Q&A box only, we'll be able to take those questions later on rather than interjecting. I'll talk just a little bit and introduce the Young Nephrologist Committee under AFRAN. And the Young Nephrologist Committee is a conglomerate, let's say that. It's one of the committees under AFRAN with representation from East Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, North Africa, and South Africa. And we try and represent those nephrologists who are under the age of 45 years and what their requirements would be. So we handed out a questionnaire earlier this year looking into the opinions and the requirements of young nephrologists all around Africa. And we had representation from more than 40 countries in Africa. And one of the issues that came up was the ability to undertake research in Africa. And out of those, 54% of respondents actually said that lack of training on proposal writing was one of the reasons that they felt challenged to undertake research. And so we approached one of our wonderful mentors, that's Professor Sarala Daisy Naika, to talk about how we could get started on this process. And maybe one of the first things to look into was the basics of research methodology to make sure that we get in quality data and quality research from Africa. So kindly allow me to introduce Professor Naika. Professor Naika is, I mean, we all know her. She's a personal mentor to many of us, but Professor Naika is Professor Emeritus of Medicine and the Chair of Graduate Studies and Clinical Research of the School of Clinical Medicine at the University of Witwatersrand, and I'm very sure that I pronounced that wrong, in Johannesburg. She is also a member of the Executive Council of the African Association of Nephrology, AFRAN, and of the Executive Council of the South African Nephrology Society from 2012 up to present. She is also was previously the academic head and department of the Department of Internal Medicine and Division of Nephrology at Wits University, and previously also the head of the Division of Nephrology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She has been, of course, the president of the South African Renal Society and the president of the South African Transplantation Society, and she has served on the ISN Council and executive committees, ISPD, and chaired the committees under AFRAN of the African Regional Committee, the Educational Ambassadors Program, the ISN Nominating Committee. I can go on and on. She was a member of the KDIGO Executive Committee, and of course, she has mentored a large number of us and supervised more than 50 students at master's and PhD levels and published 17 book chapters and approximately 190 publications in peer-reviewed journals. Professor Naika, it is an honor to have met you even, and thank you so much for coming in and partnering with us to give us this lecture on the basics of research methodology. I will allow you to take over right now, and I'll be listening with keen ears as you speak.
Thank you very much, Khalida, for that very warm welcome. And at the outset, I'd like to thank the Young Nephrologists Committee of AFRAN for inviting me to give this talk. And I would like to make one disclosure, and that is I'm by no means an expert on statistics. And my best advice is that for people wanting to engage in very in-depth research, that the young nephrologists committee does engage somebody, you know, who is a real expert in biostatistics, and I'll be happy to make some recommendations. So I'm just going to give a very basic talk, and I'll be happy to engage in discussion and questions afterwards. Seem to have trouble advancing this. Here we are. So what are the elements that we require to engage in successful research? There are various elements, and obviously the list that I've put there is not comprehensive, and one does not need every element. For instance, quite often many of us engage in research with very little funding, and we basically are really good at doing research on a shoestring. But to embark on really ambitious research, one really needs quite extensive funding. So in my view, one needs a very enabling research environment, and we'll discuss that further. And obviously I've mentioned the funding that one needs. And depending on the study that one's engaged in, one would need research participants or data. And depending on the type of study, one would need an adequate number of these to arrive at meaningful results. And then I think the key to doing successful research is the researcher himself or herself. And we'll discuss the attributes later. And I think before we go on, to say that I think a nephrologist would make a very good researcher, because I think by nature and training, we are people who are there to persist. We don't give up easily. And I think those are very important characteristics for a good researcher. Research collaborators and collaborations can be important depending on the type of research. And in fact, I think in Africa, and with the AFRAN being as well organized with the research committee, as well as the Young Nephrology Committee, I think we are really well positioned to engage in Africa-wide collaborations or regional collaborations, depending on the research questions that we want to answer. And then, of course, all research must be conducted ethically, both from the researcher's perspective, the research participants, and also from the point of view of publishing one research. And then, so we're going to get down to what sort of methods we need to undertake research. And then finally, what about research outcomes? Because a lot of research gets started, but is not completed for various reasons, can be too difficult, funds run out, the researcher loses steam. But I think that is something we need to guard against. So why should one do research? I think all of you are on this webinar would agree that research has really revolutionized all our lives. If we think that a few hundred years ago, people who reached the age of 35 or 40 were thought to be elderly because a lot of them were taken off by plague and all sorts of diseases. For instance, who knew washing hands is so important, like we've discovered with the COVID pandemic, for instance, that spraying your hands with alcohol actually helps you not to transmit the virus. So I don't think I have to convince you that research is really critical in improving all our lives from the perspective of computers, medicine, vaccines, entertainment, travel. The list is really vast. And then from a personal perspective, why does an individual need to do research? I think it's important for all of us as thinking individuals, as academics, to advance in research. And while our medical training does imbue us with a certain degree of intellectual curiosity, I think the research training is very important for us to delve further, to develop our academic life and to ask key questions that would advance medicine further. And then, of course, it's to the institution's advantage that that their staff and students embark on research. It helps them in academic ranking. It helps them to get funding. My own institution, University of Witwatersrand, don't worry, Khalida, even we struggle to say the name properly, so WITS for short. This is the third oldest South African university in continuous operation, having become a university in 1922, and it was founded as a school in 1896. So the oldest university was the University of Cape Town in 1829, followed by Stellenbosch University in 1866. Now, WITS prides itself on its research output and the fact that it has produced a large number of distinguished scholars over the years. And importantly, we've had Nobel laureates like Aaron Klug in 1982, who was a Nobel laureate for chemistry, Nadine Gordimer for literature in 1991, and Sidney Brenner of more recent memory, who received the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 2002. And of course, the most famous alumnus of WITS University is former President Nelson Mandela, who studied law and was a Nobel laureate for peace in 1993. I'm sorry, this slide is a little busy, but it just shows the national ranking of South African universities. And WITS is currently number 2 after UCT. And some people even consider whether this is important, but I think lots of universities like to be ranked and to show their place nationally as well as internationally. And in international situations, WITS has been ranging from between 149s 6 years ago, and currently something seems to have happened, and we're at number 275 in over 2,000 universities that have been ranked globally. One of the other things that South African universities undertake is rating by the National Research Foundation. The one thing I must say at the outset is that this is a voluntary process, in that nobody can make it compulsory for a member of staff to be rated. So we are all encouraged as members of staff at WITS to apply for rating by the NRF every 8 years. But it's a really formidable and time-consuming process. And so many people don't undertake it. Having said this, the rating is done by a national as well as an international panel. And it basically looks at the quality and impact of one's academic research output over the prior 8 years. And so basically there are various criteria that are looked at. And based on this, for instance, the university may be awarded research chairs. WITS hosts 30 of these South African research chairs, and there are 422 rated researchers, of whom only 24 are A-rated. And I must tell you at the outset, I'm not one of these, so here we are. Now, what about the research environment? Oh, and the data I've given about WITS is not only referable to the Faculty of Medicine, it's for the whole university. And you'd find that different faculties are ranked differently, even in the World University Rankings. Now, looking at the research environment, one needs a research environment that's supportive, that facilitates research, that's prompt, for instance, as far as providing ethical approval. It doesn't delay the researcher unduly. All these seem a given, but you'll be surprised how sometimes ethical approval can take 6 months or longer. And that is something that we've tried to guard against. Now, looking at what institutions should provide, one needs good library support, good laboratory support, either on-site or within the wider institution. And sometimes if it's not available within the institution, it should facilitate collaborations nationally as well as internationally. And then academic support in the form of research courses. And we have a very good system in the Faculty of Health Sciences, where all research, masters, honors, masters, and doctoral research are reviewed by an expert panel of senior researchers who look at the viability of the protocols, and the students only allowed to proceed with the research or according to that protocol if that passes muster. If not, the panel makes suggestions to make the protocol workable, or sometimes if it's really weak, they would make suggestions how to improve it. So there are various structures in the university, like the ethics committee, the postgraduate committee, and between them, they provide various degrees of statistical support, and that is at quite a high level at the moment. This fairly busy slide shows the various initiatives that the Faculty of Health Sciences has put together to develop postgraduate students and staff in research methodology, like providing statistics, writing skills, grant writing, and of course, supervisors are important. So it also tries to train the supervisors. And then various awards for staff and students, including travel awards, developing capacity. We've run the Carnegie and the MRC Carnegie fellowships, doctoral forums with African researchers as part of the Carnegie PhD program in some of the schools at WITS. There are various research entities that also support research, and then various postgraduate support at departmental as well as school level to try and support and improve research, the different arenas. And then there are various research lectures, talks, seminars, etc., that help. And then various research day activities, both at the school and the faculty level. Now, looking at the types of research that one can embark on, the two broad categories that have been described are qualitative and quantitative. Mainly, most of us in our area embark on quantitative research, but to tell you briefly about qualitative research, which also has a place, for instance, when one does, for instance, things like quality of health research, this is something that can be important in doing good qualitative research. So basically, one makes observations, recording what has been seen, heard, or encountered in detailed notes. Interviews can be carried out on a one-on-one basis, asking questions on a face-to-face basis. So nowadays, we can do it online as well. And an important also is focus groups, where these are done in small groups. And I think all of us are quite aware of quantitative research, which could be descriptive, experimental, etc. So what are the goals of research? In a university structure, one of the important goals is that the university is looking at various higher degrees being pursued and completed at different master's levels, doctoral research, postdoc research, and obviously not all research is for high degrees. It could also be for publication in peer-reviewed, accredited journals. And the one thing that WITS is now trying to make mandatory is that research should primarily be by publication. For instance, one paper could get a master's degree, depending on the depth of the paper, whereas a doctoral degree is much more demanding, and we'll discuss that further. So looking at the types of research, the Masters in Medicine has now become mandatory for all people who train in the various specialties of medicine, such as internal medicine, surgery, pediatrics, and all specialities. And in fact, in South Africa, master's research needs to be completed before the individual can register as a specialist and function as a specialist in South Africa. And the format used to be previously the detailed monograph. And nowadays we try to encourage publication or publishable format, where the publishable format is a promise that, that this manuscript will be submitted for publication in due course. Looking at the types of research for a master's, it could be a retrospective or prospective study, and could be a clinical audit, it could be a meta-analysis or systematic review, clinical trials. Rarely case reports are permitted, where rare cases could contribute to the literature. MSc degree, now looking at the quantity of research, MEd is only rated as 30%, and MSc could be anything from 50% to 100%, depending on the type of MSc degree that one pursues, and the type of research and format are very similar. Looking at doctoral research, PhD has to have a novel contribution. So this piece of research has to be something that is new. Previously was a standard monograph as well, whereas now publications are encouraged, an average of 4 to 6 papers with a minimum of 3 may be acceptable. And obviously this is most demanding in the form, in the requirement for examination, where one needs one local examiner, one national examiner, and an international examiner. And all 3 have to agree that this research has met standard for a doctoral degree. Now, looking at the attributes of a researcher, a successful researcher is someone with intellectual curiosity, and importantly, is committed to seeing the research through to completion, works hard, is ethical, is dedicated and determined, and also being collaborative also assists. Because nowadays, gone are the days where one sits under an apple tree or sits in a laboratory by oneself and produces research. Most research these days requires a team with everybody playing an important role in achieving the desired output. The supervisor or the mentor can be an important individual in the student's life. The supervisor should be very supportive and assist in developing the research project, prompt in providing feedback, ensures that the study is of high quality and is completed in a timely fashion, and should also assist in acquiring funding. The research collaborators, as I mentioned, could be local, regional, international, and they can actually add to the richness of the research. So one should actually welcome collaborations to strengthen the research that one is undertaking. They contribute expertise, can transfer skills, and can provide funding either towards the whole project or by funding parts of projects. And they can also contribute material data, for instance, when one is embarking on a multi-center study, which is important in ensuring that studies are adequately powered. And this is important in providing information on different populations and regions. For instance, one of the important studies that has come out of Africa is the genetic diversity of African populations, which has been well published in the last 20 years or so. And this also impacts on diseases that African populations have become prone to or predisposed to according to their genetic traits. Now, funding, as I mentioned, is necessary when one is embarking on, especially embarking on doctoral research. It's unusual for doctoral research to be carried out with no funding, where some master's research can be carried out on minimal or low levels of funding. Sources of funding locally, it's good if an institution can provide funding, but the funding that one can get from locally from institutions is usually not vast. Whereas in South Africa, there are a fair amount of national funding, like the Medical Research Council, National Research Foundation, National Kidney Foundations, and other foundations like Discovery and Pharma. Some of our students have received funding from AstraZeneca Foundation and GSK Foundation. And I think a lot of us in South Africa and Africa have received funding from ISN, from Africa, from Arua. If we are fortunate, then other funders like NIH, Wellcome Trust, MRC UK, and others have also funded our research activities. So going to the issue of research methods, I think the research question is critical. So how does one develop a research question? How does one start? So it's important that anyone embarking on whatever research, CKD, AKI, etc., has perused the literature carefully and thoroughly so that gaps in the literature are identified, and therefore one can answer these important questions and meets the needs of, say, African and other populations. And obviously, it doesn't help if the supervisor tells a doctoral student to do a project if that is something that's very boring to the student. So therefore, the student needs to have a passion for the topic and needs to be interested in the topic. So my practice is often when I meet somebody who wants to do a PhD is to ask, what are you interested in? Because it can be a very harrowing 3 to 5 years, depending on whether one is doing this project full-time or part-time. Because if it's something that's not interesting, it's actually, it can be very painful to pursue a doctoral degree. It can be painful at the best of times, but if you're not interested in the project, then it can be even more so. So, as I said, when one develops a research proposal, one needs to review the literature and therefore come up with what the gap is and what has motivated your specific project. You need to come up with a hypothesis for your project, and what are your aims and objectives in embarking on the project? What are the methods that you're going to utilize to bring your research to fruition? And obviously, your project has to be approved by the ethics committee. Now, very important is the sample size. It's important to have an adequate sample size that's powered to achieve significant results. And therefore, it's important to embark on a topic that allows adequate numbers of participants. These don't necessarily have to be local. One could collaborate with other sites, either nationally or elsewhere, and have suitable collaborators to achieve an adequate study population. And one needs, when undertaking sample size calculations, to consider attrition, loss to follow-up, laboratory mishaps, etc. And one has to make a working guess as to what number this is going to be. Is this going to be 10%, 25%, etc.? And then increase your sample size accordingly so that you could achieve significant results. So this direct quote says that determining an appropriate sample size is one of the most important factors in statistical analysis. If the sample size is too small, it will not yield valid results. And while large sample sizes are very good because they yield very significant results, a sample size that's too large will significantly increase the cost and time taken. So generally one does not encourage a massive sample size for these reasons, because it may not be doable within one's time constraints and funding. So looking at sample size calculations, there are various formulae that one could use, and various things, various aspects that determine sample size, such as specific research aim, the number and nature of variables involved, the sampling or data collection method, and the intended method for analysis. So this is one of the formulae that can be used to determine sample size. And looking further at the calculation, this is an actual formula used by one of my recent PhD students, where he calculated that he needed a population of 362 in his sample. But because he determined that there would be an attrition rate of about 20%, so he therefore increased his sample size accordingly to try and achieve that. So as I've mentioned, and nowadays the various packages such as data, etc., can help one to easily calculate a sample size. Now, as I said, ethical approval is very important. So one cannot embark on research without having ethical approval. And ethical approval could be granted by one's institution or other entity that's qualified or constituted to review and assess the proposed research. It ensures that no harm is done to participants. It ensures that research is carried out with informed consent and is satisfied that the research will be successful in having qualified researchers, having appropriate funding, and that the research is feasible and within the expertise of the research team. And all research has to be conducted as per the Declaration of Helsinki with informed consent from adult participants and children. If the child is old enough, they can assent, but one also needs parental consent in that situation. Looking at data collection, one needs to have an appropriate tool to collect and enter one's data. We have, most of our students use REDCap or Stata, though there are others such as Excel, Radar, etc. Very important that one needs to be very meticulous in collecting and entering data. The saying rubbish in, rubbish out is so true, because if data is not accurate, then one shouldn't embark on the research. And journals are requesting that data is available for review, or it needs to be deposited in a repository. So that's also an important issue for many journals, that researchers have to make the data available. Looking at statistical analysis, one of the important questions to be answered is the data normally distributed? And one of the tests that most statisticians recommend is the Shapiro work test to decide on the normality of data. And this is generally used for smaller sample sizes, like if your sample is 50 or less, whereas other tests such as the KS can be used for larger samples. And it's very important to decide on whether the sample is normally distributed or not, because that determines whether your further analysis uses parametric or non-parametric analysis. And I don't think we need to discuss the tests of normality any further. And looking at the statistical analysis that's used for tests that are normally distributed, one can use a range of parametric tests depending on what you want to look at, whether you're looking at dependent variables or paired differences, etc. So the tests listed on the left show the tests that should be used for normally distributed samples, and the tests on the right show you the non-parametric tests that one should use. And as I said, I would strongly recommend that one could have a statistician discuss this further using a biostatistician, using practical data and results. And then what about multivariable or multivariate analysis? This refers to statistical methods that simultaneously analyze multiple measurements for individuals or objects under investigation. And therefore, if there are 3 or more variables, then one would use a multivariable analysis. So what are the research outcomes that one is looking at? Well, as I've mentioned, if one is embarking on this for higher degrees, one would want the research to be submitted and passed by examiners, appropriate examiners. And then further, for research to be completed, one would expect publications. As I've mentioned, a master's would be 1 or 2 papers, a PhD on average 4 to 6 papers. I apologize for just picking on these 3 postgraduate students at WITS who did their master's in nephrology. And I think while I apologize, it's also deliberate. I think a lot of you will recognize Dr. Muzamil Hussain, who was an ISN fellow at WITS and excelled himself as the majority of our ISN fellows did, by finishing their nephrology training, successfully navigating the South African nephrology examinations, and also completing a doctoral degree, in his case a PhD, and publishing about 6 papers from his research. Lerato, I think she's here as a science student who did a PhD with us, and I assisted in her supervision. The person that I also want to talk about is Alex Kasambili, who's from Kenya, and he arrived in South Africa as a Fogarty student to do a master's degree, and he ended up undertaking one of my projects as a master's, but did so well that his master's was converted to a PhD before he completed the master's. So Alex then completed his PhD, and he was really amazing in that his first ever paper was this highly cited paper in JSON. So while one does not expect one's PhD student in his first attempt to publish in the top-ranked nephrology journal, so this was Alex's output, and Alex now runs a laboratory in Kenya. This picture is Dr. Thinmao Han, who's also quite remarkable student who came from Myanmar, one of the refugees of the war some years ago. He trained with us in internal medicine and then did a nephrology fellowship with me at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And he did a master's project. And I must tell you why he features here, that his first paper ever was this paper in Kidney International, which is also highly cited and interestingly showed that not all patients with HIVAN need to have, excuse me, severe proteinuria or renal dysfunction. He showed that a significant proportion of patients presenting with microalbumin, as it was called then, had HIVAN. And this was the first time this finding was reported. And just, I've highlighted in red all the students who came to us as ISN fellows. And Dr. Amira was my first student at WITS. And I think that's one of the things that I've highlighted in her, besides the fact that she achieved her MSc with distinction. So that was a very good start for my research career, having Christina Amira at WITS. And at the same time, Jules Kabahizi. Christina came from Nigeria, and as I said, was my first ISN fellow at WITS. I've had my first ISN fellow in Durban was Yewand Tadesa, whom you all know very well. And Jules Kabahizi did a master's and won the prize in internal medicine for the best masters of that year. And also highlighted Dr. Han and told you about him. Dr. James Chabu is remarkable, and he taught me what can be done if people are really determined enough. James was given a ISN fellowship for 6 months, and he said to me, Professor Naika, I want to do a PhD. So I was quite horrified and shocked. And I said, James, you can't do this in 6 months. He said, no, I will try and do it in 12 to 18 months. So after 6 months, we managed to get some extension of funding from ISN, not much, but some. And I must say, James finished his PhD in 18 months. And he was my first PhD student ever that I supervised. And I think, you know, he really needs to be in the Hall of Fame for teaching me a lot about what can be done if one is committed and determined enough. All the others in bold are the various ISN fellows who, or people who were externally funded, who did a range of master's degrees or PhD degrees. And I've already told you about Muzamal and Alex. And the other person that I need to mention further is Dr. Waziri Bala from Ghana, whom a lot of you would know. He came also to WITS, trained with us, did a nephrology fellowship for 2 years, got his exams, got his PhD. And his further claim to fame is that he did a master's in biostatistics at WITS in this period. And this degree was awarded with distinction. So he should be a really good resource person for all of us in Africa. More recent students, Stephen Oguntula, Aisha Nalado, and Aliu Abdu, who achieved their PhDs, also really hardworking, excellent students. I've highlighted Professor Anthony Mayers, who achieved his doctoral degree in medicine on kidney stones. And I think it's important to mention a South African student here. All the rest of the South Africans I haven't mentioned, because Anthony Mayers was my professor, my teacher, when I went to WITS to do a 6-month transplant fellowship to complete my nephrology training. So it's interesting that as a student, you can also be your teacher supervisor in due course. And I've also been involved with the Faculty of Science and did some very interesting research looking at apoptosis in cancer and kidney disease. with my colleague, Professor Zodwa Dlamini. And we have some current projects ongoing, and we're looking forward to Alfred Miremo from Tanzania finishing his project with us, hopefully by the end of this year. So these three ladies in this picture are very important. Professor Raquel Dorte, who runs a translational medicine laboratory, a very talented molecular biologist and geneticist. Dr. Caroline Dickens, fabulous molecular biology, genetics, and also biostatistics. Therese, who supports all our students. All of our students will tell you how wonderful these three team members are. And Therese herself is finishing her PhD, hopefully by the end of this year. And this young man in the middle is a person whom I have to thank for it all. He was my PhD supervisor, Professor Kantibula, who spent 5 years in the University of KwaZulu-Natal, having retired at the young age of 60 from the University of Bristol, where he trained a qualified medical doctor who did not really practice medicine because research was his passion. And he trained a whole lot of masters and doctoral students in Bristol and internationally. So when he came to Durban, he got together a team of students, a few masters, and a lot of us doing PhDs. So when he retired and eventually went back to the UK and visited us in Durban 15 years later, all of us from Durban, Marlon Surf, who works for MRC in Cape Town, all of us tried to get to Durban to meet with our supervisor. Unfortunately, the students in the UK and the US could not make that event. And I think all of us who trained with him owe him a big debt. I learned from him that no question is stupid. Any question merits careful consideration, deep discussion. And, you know, he never said something cannot be done. Let's look at how we can do it. So this can-do attitude, I think, is very important for students and supervisors. So I'd like to acknowledge a lot of people, our research team, the postgraduate students who are so important. Without them, I would not have had such fun doing the research that I've done. Likewise, my clinical and scientist collaborators at UKZN, WITS, the NIH, and more recently, the ARC collaborators from Uganda, Malawi, and the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. And as I've mentioned, our WITS Labs team is absolutely phenomenal. The various funders who helped us with our research, our institutions. And then, as I said, my biggest thanks to my PhD supervisor, Professor Kantibula. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor.
I hope I didn't overstay my welcome.
Not at all. In fact, I wondered how the time just went. I'm looking at it and we are 6 minutes to 8 o'clock our time. And it gave me so much to think about. I'm trying to read my notes over here and my handwriting is atrocious. But what I think I got was...
happy to share the slides, so you don't need to worry about that.
Thank you, Prof. And I can see we're recording, so I hope other people who've not been able to make it right now could log in later and have a look at the recording. But what I've generally gained is that, or taken home, is that we need to have a culture of research to start with. And I think that might be a big deal, and lobby to start research departments and research offices within our own institute for those of us who are not under universities, and make research a priority, and thinking about the library support, the training, the statistical support, and then focusing on that publishable format and knowing that we're going to do that. And thank you so much I've also thought about where we would get funding. And actually I've looked it up and I didn't know, and I was posting here on the chat that I just discovered that Kenya has a National Research Fund and National Commission for Science and Technology, and I didn't know. So that's a whole lot for us to think about. Maybe I could start by asking you my question first, and that's me taking advantage. And just asking that, do you think it's possible to have a career in research? And if that was so, what steps would you take to make this feasible?
That's one of the things we are grappling with at WITS. We want researchers. So we have 2 cadres of researchers. Our laboratory team, whom I showed you, the 3 very talented ladies who make our research possible. And I must say, I found it really amazing working with them. So one of the things I think is that universities don't value their researchers highly enough. But having said that, we are trying to improve their status, because a lot of them, for instance, Caroline Dickens, even after her PhD, was on a technical track at a very low level, salary level. And we managed to convert her to a scientist track. And once you're on that, then one could go ahead in the ranks and become a professor and that sort of thing. Now, as far as a clinician goes, we have the clinician scientist track. So those of us who have PhDs. So one of the things WITS has encouraged is by encouraging clinicians to take, say, 2 or 3 years off from clinical duties to pursue their PhDs full-time. And then once one achieves their PhD, what then? So that's what we are grappling with at the moment, because most of us as clinicians work for the Department of Health, and all of us who work for the Department of Health know that you have to work 100% for the Department of Health. So when do you do the research? So now, because there's supposed to be a joint agreement between the university and the province, we are actually fighting for academic time, which will allow you to do your research, so many days a week or so many hours a week where you can do research. So that is a big disappointment for a lot of the more recent category of students. Like, whereas I did my PhD running a Department of Nephrology and running half a medical ward, which is like 30 beds, and teaching a whole lot of people, which means that I didn't take any vacation for 5 years, So depending on the support you have, you need to be very committed. Whereas, as I said, it's much easier at WITS now if you can get one of those clinician scientist programs, and hopefully in the future, we will negotiate this academic time, and that's what we're trying to fight for. So the short answer is, as a clinician, to do full-time research, unless you're in a research position, like one of my colleagues who's just finished her PhD now, has been employed by one of our sister hospitals as a research director to develop research, to help the clinicians to do research. So those sort of posts and positions are few and far between, but it's wonderful if you can get it, if that's your passion. But I think a lot of clinicians want both. You want to be a clinician and you want to be a researcher, and you want to have adequate time to do both. But it can be very tough.
Yeah. And
I think sabbaticals in a university, so that can also help you to do your research. Yeah.
Okay. There are some other questions here that I'll post to you within the Q&A box, and the first is from Yannick. A very nice presentation, Professor Sarala. Number one, since COVID-19, there is a multitude of publications, including preprints. Do these preprints have scientific value?
I think one of the things to be aware of about a preprint is that it has not undergone peer review. So as long as you bear that in mind and read the preprint critically and carefully, it doesn't mean that it has no value. I think it can be very valuable. And obviously a lot of these preprints undergo peer review later. And having said that, we've all seen that some of these haven't stood the test of peer review have had to be withdrawn because one has found that, for instance, data can be faulty. I'm sure we've all seen the recent ivermectin story, which still needs to be unraveled, where data is duplicated and analysis not done properly. But having said that, a lot of preprints are very useful, and I think it's a way of bringing information and data for public scrutiny and to inform people at a very early stage.
And I think that's maybe another area that we'll have to focus on in terms of critical appraisal of a paper, yes, which is so important. Second question, Prof, thank you for that. How can an African Francophone PhD candidate collaborate with, for example, Professor Sarala or another expert for his project? From Yannick.
Yeah, I must say, I feel very deficient when I think about my Francophone colleagues like Professor Gloria, Professor Yao, Professor Elena Sunga, who are bilingual, and they are fully bilingual. So I think it would depend on the English language skills, because as I said, I'm deficient in that I can say good morning and thank you in French, maybe order coffee. Other than that, I may not be very good, a good mentor. You know, if we can't communicate, I think the important thing is to be able to communicate. So, but having said that, I think in Francophone Africa, we've got very talented researchers. So I think primarily one could collaborate. One could have a team where you could have someone like me with my deficiencies and maybe someone from a Francophone country who could also, you know, collaborate and help supervise the research. And in fact, that's one of the ways we're developing supervisors as well, is to put a novice in with an experienced supervisor to try and develop the skills, very much like how we learned as interns. You know, you work under supervision, as it were.
Thank you, Prof. We have all heard loud and clear your offer. And maybe I'll give you the last question, which is, there's two, but let's maybe focus on the first one because of time. Thank you, Professor Naika, for the wonderful talk. My question is, what is the best type of statistical analysis to use for a cross-sectional study?
I think it would depend on what sort of data you want to compare. Firstly, is the data normally distributed or not? And whether you want to look at one characteristic or multiple characteristics. You know, so if it's normally distributed and you just want to compare two things, you might want to do a t-test, a t-test. Whereas if it's not normally distributed and if you want to compare multiple data, you might want to do a multivariate analysis. So as I said, it all depends on exactly what your intention is. And as I said, it's not exactly my forte, but that's my understanding of how one does it. I think in a way, we're at an advantage and a disadvantage in that we have such good statistical support at adverts, in that a statistician is always part of our team and part of our, of our publications. So even when we get hammered by reviewers, our statistician can help us to counter the sometimes really harrowing critique that we face.
Okay,
but then it's important for you as a researcher to understand the basic statistics, even if you're not doing it yourself.
And you've actually emphasized several times during your talk that maybe pointing out to Elliot there, my colleague, that we would need a statistician maybe to give us a talk just on a bit of basic biostatistics, which I think would be great for our training. And then, Prof, I'll give you one last question.
And the one thing, sorry, Khalida, if I may interrupt, one of the things we've done is that when our students go to statistics courses, we encourage them to go with the data. So they work on their data on these courses. So it's absolutely valuable. And that's what I would encourage on any future biostatistical course that you run.
That makes a lot of sense because it makes it very practical.
Yes, and meaningful.
Yes. I'm going to, somebody here, this is an anonymous attendee who's posted maybe the last question, and I think this person has been burnt in the past, saying, comment on the role of the ERC. Is it purely ethical, or is it involved in what I'd say is grammar and titles, etc.?
The role of?
The role of the ERC, the Ethics Research Committee. Should they only comment on ethical issues, or are they also involved in titles and grammatical errors?
I don't think your supervisor should allow you to submit anything with grammatical errors. Number one. One of the things is that if things are really bad, because as an examiner, one of my, I was internal examiner for someone in a science faculty. And, you know, I tried to read their PhD, and after about 30 pages, I had such a headache, you know. I actually returned it and I said, please have this thing edited and then resubmit for examination. And that's the one and only time I've done that. But I must say I've done a lot of editing and correcting of grammar for my students. So having said that, I don't think any ethics committee should reject anything on grammar. They should advise you to get your stuff edited properly. So provided the science, the project is good, it should not be turned down, because ethics, the primary ethics, as I said, we've already discussed what are the ethical requirements and what they should be looking for. So just because your grammar is poor for whatever reason, then I think it's a no-no that is turned down for that reason. And I'm sorry that's happened to someone on the webinar.
Professor, I think I'll hand over to Elliot maybe to just give a vote of thanks, but the response to this webinar has been overwhelming. And we've had so many attendees and everybody just congratulating you on the chat and saying thank you. And I think you have lit a fire under many people, as I'm seeing here, needs for collaboration and all the rest. And you know, that's actually what we are hoping for. So thank you so much personally, Professor, for your time. You always say yes whenever we call upon you. And just want to say thank you for that. I see Elliot there, and I'm just going to let him take over a little bit.
I'll just interrupt for one more thing. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Can I also advise that the Young Nephrologist Committee lies with Christina Amira, because she's very keen on promoting collaborations. And I think Elliot and you are aware of this. So I think the rest of the committee should also work with her committee. I think collaborations are the answer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. So I think we are 7 minutes past our time. But well, Prof, thank you very much. Indeed, I mean, we just communicated and Prof was happy to do this, and it's been fantastic. It's actually the best so far, with over 114 at the point. I mean, participants, you know, you virtually held everybody through the lecture, and we are so grateful. And thank you, Halida. I think you did wonderful in terms of the moderation. Thank you, Letitia. Thank you, Sharon, on the call. And thank you, all of you who joined. I think it's been great, and it's not the last. You are going to hear from us, from the Young Nephrologist. Already, we are working towards the next one. Sooner than later, you hear the details. And please let us know if you have any interest in any topic you'd want us to be discussing, and we'll get the experts you know, to come and share with us. And on behalf of the Young Nephrologist Committee, thank you very much, Prof, and thank you all for coming, and good night.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being with you. Bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great night, Prof.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.